Hi, I'm Ben, and you found Theology Over Easy. Christology is the branch of theology focusing on the person and work of Jesus. Jesus was viewed as the human embodiment of God very soon after his resurrection. Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 1, verse 19, that all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in Jesus. And in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 to 11, we have what scholars believe was probably an early Christian hymn which affirms that God took on our very nature in Jesus. So within a couple of decades after his resurrection, Christians were affirming his divine human nature. Last week we reviewed the two primary alternative Christologies, the docetic and the adoptionist. The underlying assumptions of either one can work their way into our own thinking, most often without us even knowing it. Take docetism. That separates the humanness of Jesus from his divine nature. The divine or the spiritual and the human or the material are completely separate. Now, have you ever made a distinction in your mind between the secular and the spiritual? Many people do without even knowing it. When I was a very young priest, I once tried to do a teaching with my vestry on the importance of prayer in our meetings. I thought that was a pretty normal thing to do. I could see that some people were squirming a little in their seats. Then suddenly one person pounded his fist on the table and shouted, "I don't come here to be spiritual. I come here to do the business of the church." Alrighty then. But if God is the creator of everything, then in a sense, everything is spiritual. Now that doesn't mean that everything is divine. It does mean that how we live and work and have our being in the world is at least as important as our inner spiritual well-being. It means, for example, that caring for creation is the logical and spiritual expression of our worship of God. Think of it like this. Have you ever thought, I wish I could just get away from the daily grind and be spiritual just for a little while? Now, that might mean going on a retreat, or it might mean working in your garden, or for someone like me, going for a bike ride. There should be no doubt in our minds that there is enormous value in spending time getting our hearts and minds refocused on God. At the same time, we need to be careful. We do need alone time with God, but the daily grind isn't unspiritual. And I think our inner conflict over this is a reflection of our struggle to connect, for example, worshiping God in the Eucharist and being God's image in the everyday world. Even that requires a little bit of clarification. Everyone is made in the image of God. This is what gives every person intrinsic dignity. But our status as image of God people is far more than that. To be made in the image of God means that we are created to reflect, actively reflect, the gracious, loving, and just rule of the Creator out into the world, into the secular, and the praises of creation or the secular back to God. There isn't anything more spiritual than that. Docetism at its core is rooted in our human desire to flee and avoid risk and vulnerability. But the reality of risk and suffering is an inescapable component of the incarnation. The late Bishop Fitz Allison wrote, "Love is never risked or expressed until someone loves. Docetism is the religious way of escaping having love tested in the flesh." Indeed. In that way, docetism is kind of like sugar. It tastes good, but ultimately rots your teeth and leaves you spiritually flabby. I'll see you next time on Theology Over Easy.